let us start with our prayer before we get even more, railroaded. We lift our thoughts, raise our thoughts to the greater spiritual realm. And we open this meeting, our congregation, to all brothers and sisters who, like us, are in need of education and consolation. We ask for the presence of our mentors, our spiritual guides, to bless us and guide us, that we may have a constructive participation and discussion, that we may understand the most important principles of the lessons of today, and be capable to find within ourselves strength and courage to apply them in our daily lives. Our studies are nothing more than opportunities that we have to improve ourselves, to change ourselves and implement new ideas, new hopes. Let us all do this together, constructively, and become beacons of light to all of those who are around us, taking the light that we receive from our mentors here to them, sharing with them, and in doing so, assist everyone to make this a better world. It is with our hearts filled with immense gratitude for all the blessings that we are about to receive, that we ask your permission, dear benefactors, to start this meeting today. So be it. Good morning, everyone. So we are back to the book On the Way to the Light by Francisco Xavier and the Spirit Emmanuel. And we are, I believe it's chapter 12, the Advent of Jesus. And we have there the grand lesson. And we are going to ask our birthday girl of the day, Zoraida, to read for us. Before anything, birthday, Zoraida. Many more.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Okay, so chapter 12, the Advent of Jesus, the Major. The Major marked the starting point for the saving lesson of the Christ, as if it declaring
Zoraida. Oh, no, Zoraida, at the grand lesson.
The grand lesson, yeah.
At the grand lesson. Because we have already started this chapter. So just go one or two pages over. It's the grand lesson.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, the grand lesson. Mm-hmm. The world was indeed a vast wayward flock. Each culture made religion a new source of vanities, and many religious cults of the East were headed for the blatant torrent of licentiousness and immortality. But Christ brought the world the eternal fundamentals of the truth and love. His kind and generous word brought together all the unfortunates and all the sinners. He chose the poorest and the simplest places to live the immensity of his sublime lessons, showing humankind that the truth did not require the opulent setting of the Areopagus or forums and temples to be heard in all its mysterious beauty. His sermons in the open were the sake of the most defenseless and outcast individuals, as if to show that his word had come to bring together all human beings within the same vibration of fraternity and on the same luminous pathway of love. He brought peacefully against all the official wrongs of Judaism and renewed the ancient law with his doctrine of enlightenment, tolerance, and forgiveness. He spread the clearest visions of the immortal life, teaching humankind that there is something greater than homeland, flags, bloodlines, and human laws. His profound, forceful, and compassionate word reestablished every philosophy cleared the way for the sciences, and would have united all the religions of the earth by now if human impiety had not given way to iniquity on the scales of redemption.
Okay, thank you, Sarada.
You're welcome.
So before anyone says it, yes, we had already read this. All right.
Yes,
Remember that we
yes,
had the discussion about the Areopagus, that it was a place in Athens where they used to have, they used to carry out judgment of what was important for the city, for not just judgment of individuals, but where they would make important decisions. The idea here of the Areopagus is that you did not need to be an individual that was highly educated, because the members of the Areopagi were always individuals that were highly educated. Priests, priestesses, you have the idea of those, the very, but very, very few that were literate, right? Philosophers. So in this particular case, what we mean in this chapter is that Christ brought the simplicity back to the
yes,
concepts of, of religion, because at that time, if we were not going back towards a polytheistic ideas and ideals, we were actually going, religions everywhere in the world were in some ways suffering the attack of less enlightened minds, and uh, were being shrouded in rituals, we're being shrouded in physical manifestations at the expense of the religiosity, at the expense of what was pure, what was simple, what actually brought all humans together and showed the importance of assisting one another, of living well with one another. So this grand lesson is the return to simplicity primarily. That there was no need to be philosophical about it, that there was no need to be highly educated to be able to understand religion. And this is why Christ in particular, in the incarnated form of Jesus, chose specifically the simple individuals and the simple situations and facts of life. Even in the allegories, even in his teachings, he looks and he addresses us with examples such as the feasts, a wedding feast, because everyone could understand that. You didn't have to have a degree to do this. You did not have to belong to a particular sect, or be highly educated to understand the wedding feast, or to understand things such as the parable of the talents, or the parable of the widow with the 2 coins. All of these were simple enough that the most uneducated individual, the least educated person, could truly understand, grasp, and most importantly, relate to the meaning of the lesson. There is also another idea there. By making it simpler examples, it was easier for these individuals also to relay this, because Christ was telling us stories. Every time he had something important to teach us, it would come to us from him in the form of a story, or in the form of a situation from our daily lives. And this allowed the individuals listening to him to be able not only to understand for themselves, but to be able to retell that story to others. If he had made it very complex, a very sophisticated story, or even scenario, perhaps those simple individuals would not be able to tell that story to others. Quite the opposite. So the idea here, the sublimity of the lessons, is the simplicity that we have already again forgotten, because we embroider it, we dress it up extensively and excessively with rituals, with rhetoric, with philosophical ideals around it, and we forget the most important thing, which is the application of the simple lessons in our daily lives. The grand lesson here was for humanity to go back to that way, the simple ways.
It's interesting, right, Julio? Because for those that watched Peter's presentation yesterday on Go
Oh
and
yes,
Preach, he
the
spoke
priest.
mainly about St. Francis of Assisi, that 1,000 years after, more or less 1,000 years after this, how the church was all uh, the richness and the, you know, the wealthy, and how he brought back, he tried to bring back the teachings of Christ, the example of Christ, right? How we deviated so much from the true teachings of Jesus. It's very interesting. It's worth watching the lecture.
Yes, it
So
was,
we
it
have,
was.
go ahead,
Go
please.
ahead. No. I was going to say just what John said. I heard it yesterday, and it was beautiful, as simple as it can be, and yet just like this lesson we're getting now, and, so many thousands of years have gone by, and yet Jesus brought the simplest stories, and yet simple to the mind, and yet now we have all the education we could absorb and get and receive, and yet with all that, we still, the simplest stories and the simplest uh, learning that we can get, we still are I guess, over compensated with so much education that we go to beyond the understanding of the simple way of what Christ taught us. And yet still today we go back and you're saying it so, you explain it so beautiful, and yet what is it that we just don't seem to thrive on and do what he brought all these beautiful stories, and still so hard to deal with. I guess as we continue our lives, we will get there. I'm sure we will. We're getting it very slowly, but we're getting it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Zoraida, the
Okay,
next one, the divine word.
the divine
Can I
word.
ask a question first?
Oh, sure,
Yeah,
go ahead.
sure.
Uh, Especially in the ritual part, that we put all these things in order to make pretty attract people to religions. Since the spiritism, since I remember, I've been hearing, there is no need for example, let's talk about spiritism. There's no need for water. There's no need for a table with a white cloth. There's no need for candles, a lot of stuff. But we keep on doing the same thing, and I understand that you know we do what we do in order to make people feel better, or not sure. Even with the passes, we know that the lay of hands is, there's an importance of that, but we also know that if we just stay in the particular room, we will receive everything that we need. So the question is, in terms of spiritism, let's not talk about other religions. Are we moving in the direction that all these rituals that we still do nowadays will not be, um, we're not going to be performing that, or we're going to keep on doing that? What's the approach of the rituals?
So, in terms of rituals, we don't need them. Faith and the communication with the spiritual realm are completely independent. from rituals. From the point of view that if I decide that I believe faith-wise, I really do not need any physical manifestation, any physical principle, or any physical um, um, action, basically. That is when I have incorporated in myself, I have implemented in myself a faith that goes beyond the physical realm, a trust, a confidence in something that does not require evidence, and it's in me. However, we are not there yet. So we all of us, okay, have to one extent or another a need to have something to remind us, to allow us perhaps to get into that in contact with our inner self, to allow us to look inside of ourselves. So for some, it may be lighting a candle. For others, it is the fluidified water, a cup of water that we put next to us when we go to bed at night or when we do the gospel at home. Are these things wrong? No, they are unnecessary. They are not necessary. So they are, pardon the expression, theatrics, props to our faith. They are not the play itself. They are props to our play. So they are theatrics. Now, having said this, it's important that we understand that we are not bashing it, that we are not against them, that we are just saying that at that moment, or at this moment, we are still in need of some of these things. But the more that we study, the more we understand, the less important these props are going to be for our true faith, the true play in this theater of life. And eventually we'll find ourselves completely disconnected, independent of these props, of these rituals. So there'll be no special time of the day, there'll be no special time in the year. There's not going to be any flame or fire. There's not going to be a particular dress code. We will actually have a faith that is simple, that it will exist in us independently from anything else. The only way to answer the question generally would be to impose a code of conduct, and Spiritism does not do that. So what we can do with this particular question is answer it for ourselves. So I may ask myself, Julio, what is it that you need when you do the gospel at home? Do you need the gospel to be at 4 in the morning? Not because that's when you can do it, but because you think that the planets are better aligned or this and that, and the moon will be shining at light at a particular angle. So I have to ask myself that. Do I need a candle? Do I need to have fluidified water on the table? Do I need to have a cup of water behind my back, which is the water where supposedly the mentors are going to put all the bad vibrations that they take away from me so I can dispose of that water later down the drain? So I have to ask myself these things. And I have to ask myself these things today and compare to what I was doing 10 years ago or 20 years ago now, or even 37 years ago. How much have I grown in these 37 years that I have been a spiritist? Do I still do these things? Do I still put the white cloth on the table? Right? So I can only compare myself to what I was. In general terms, we should not worry about it. I think it's a good question because it allows us to have this discussion. Because if for me to answer in general terms, we would have to have an imposition of a code of conduct, of behavior, and that would make our faith dogmatic. We have to let every single individual to discover these things for himself or herself, not through an imposition. However, I want to convey one interesting thing. When we go to a spiritist center, we might say, oh, but this spiritist center does not give fluidified water. Oh, this spiritist center no longer has passes. It is the responsibility of the spiritist center, of any spiritist center, and I should say even all spiritist centers, to lead by example. So the spiritist center should not condemn any ritual someone might have, but the spiritist center should not embark on a ritualistic approach. The spiritist center should not be the one creating rituals. For instance, imagine that we would say, when we can go back to SGNY, they would say, you cannot wear jeans in the Spiritist Center. You have to come dressed, formally. You cannot be casual, or we would say, no, you have to dye your hair a certain color. You have to wear a certain shirt with a certain color. All of these things would be, then there it would be wrong, because the spiritist center should be the place that leads by example. It should be the place that should slowly, maturely convince us by example, not imposition, that we should move away from the rituals. But if the spiritual center then does the opposite, it starts rituals, imposes rituals, then it's not actually doing its proper job of being a spiritual center. It should be called some other name, but not a spiritual center. Okay, so we have to be very careful when it comes to rituals. They are still important to some of us, but we will all rid ourselves of them eventually.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was watching a spiritist conversation yesterday with one Brazilian speaker, and he was telling us that he gave a lecture at the Spiritist Center, and there was like 100 people there. And then 1 year later, he came back. They invited him back, and there were like 10 people. And he asked the directors, what happened here? Why you have only 10 people and you had the full house a year ago? And he said, oh, we decided to end up with passes. We're no longer giving passes, so most of the people stopped coming. Again, radical measures that don't help. We need to educate. And what Julio said,
Thanks, both of you guys. Thanks.
Okay.
Okay? Okay.
you
The
lost me.
divine word. Huh?
Sorry, João, we lost you.
You lost me.
Yeah, he left.
So if you want to finish your thoughts, João, because you were saying
Yeah.
and then you stop there.
Okay.
You mentioned about the lecture. You mentioned that the person, the Spiritism made a radical decision of stopping the passes, and after that, you stopped.
Yeah. So we need to be very conscious. Like Julio said, we're not going to create new rituals, but we cannot imagine that we are all perfect and we all don't need anything else. So you go to a Spiritist center, you are used to receive your passes, you are used to have your water. We're not going to make it disappear. We are going to teach and educate people to rid themselves from the need of rituals. But we are going to, most of us, we still need the rituals. So that the only way that we can open ourselves to be treated by the spirits is when we sit at the chair to receive the passes. It works better if we than if we don't, or if there are no passes. So we are going to do what's best for for most of us that come to the Spiritist Center to feel comfortable, to feel well received, and to fulfill their needs. So this has to be in a smooth way, right? You cannot do anything radical, because everything radical creates disruptions, and disruptions are never good.
Thank you.
Okay, Sarada, go ahead,
Okay.
the divine word.
Yes, the divine word. It is not our purpose to give a new interpretation to the eternal words of Christ in the Gospels. That has already been done by nearly all the world's religious schools. It is up to their communities and followers to observe his immortal teaching and to apply it to themselves in the mechanics of their daily lives in order for overall renewal to take place according to his sublime exemplification. If the major and the cross are an unforgettable lesson, the Divine Master's examples should all the more be instructive for us regarding how he handled the vicissitudes of earthly life. His unforgettable lessons have consequences for all areas of planetary existence. In the sense of renewing the social and political institutions of humankind through people's moral transformation in a new age of economic justice and universal harmony. In light of the imperialist doctrines of today, it may seem that the triumphant of true Christianity is still a long way off, but we must realize that 2,000 years have passed since the divine word, 2,000 years in which people have torn at one another in his name and have brandished banners of schism and destruction. In the name of his teachings of forgiveness and love, they have burned and slaughtered, massacring hopes in all hearts. Nevertheless, this century will denote a visible transformation in every area of life. Suffering will finish the generous deeds of Christian truth, since human beings have rejected love in all their contemplations of progress.
Thank you. Okay, so we had the divine word, we had the examples. Christ did not preach. Christ actually led an exemplary life. It was in his examples that we find the importance of his teachings, because he showed us what we were able and we are able to do ourselves. It was not something that was rhetorical, there was some philosophical debate. No, he was amidst the simplest, the most ignorant, the neediest individuals of the time, and he managed to touch their hearts, and he managed to bring to his ideals of peace, of fraternity, of universal love, those who in principle could not even read or write. And what have we done? We have distorted the ideals, we have distorted the words, and those who embraced them with a fanaticism so great, because it was an unchecked, unbridled faith, an irrational faith, a dogmatic faith, that we started imposing our beliefs onto others. And when they did not comply, we simply exterminated them. Religious wars, philosophical wars on this planet have killed more than all the diseases put together. We have been very ruthless with ourselves, because we forget, especially now that we are studying Spiritism, that we are studying reincarnation, that we perhaps murdered ourselves in the past. We murdered a version of ourselves in the past, a version that if we were to look today, we would be horrified by looking at us, whether as the victim or the perpetrator of the crime, because we had very, very strange, intensely irrational ideas, and we had no tolerance for anyone who espoused an idea that was different than ours. The divine word was not the divide, and yet that was exactly what we, Christ itself, did not have the intention of dividing us. But the way we manipulated his words led to the division, led to the schism, led to the destruction of one another. We need to go back to this Christian truth. Nowadays, we are seeing another form of schism, another form of, of movement in the sense of separating us, extricating us from the words of Christ, from the examples of Christ. We allow technology, our own discovery, to do that. Technology itself is, or technological progress itself, it's not bad or good. It's the use we make of it. When Emmanuel wrote this book, dictated this book, of course, this is last century, the 20th century. I don't think that he would have changed this sentence here, that we have rejected love in all their cogitations of progress. So I think it's still valid today, still very valid today. What we saw at the time of Allan Kardec in the mid-19th century was a big separation between religious beliefs and scientific beliefs, to the point that if you espoused one, you could not have the other. It was inconceivable. And this is why Spiritism suffered so much at the beginning, because it was exactly that which it was proposing. It was proposing a form of union, that science, religion, and philosophy would become allies and would merge together into a single thing. Today, we perhaps don't debate so much in terms of the philosophical beliefs, but the scientific and religious beliefs are still at each other's throats, probably even more so than they were at the time of Kardec, because we have evolved to a point where we have a lot more from the scientific side to give us a more comfortable life, or cure or amelioration of diseases, and so on and so forth, to justify a very, very radical view of these things. And the question is, are we forgetting the divine word? Are we simply turning a deaf ear to that divine word? Most of us are turning that deaf ear because we are moving away from it. Now, not so much with intolerance against other faith, not so much intolerance against other rituals and this and that, but perhaps in our own way, by our concept of individualism, exacerbated individualism, because progress, technological progress, in a way or another, allows us to isolate ourselves more and more. But the question is that good for us? Is that constructive for us? When I mean good here, I don't mean like good and bad, or evil. I mean like good in the sense of being constructive, being healthy for us. You have to think about it. At the time of Christ, if you go back 2,000 years, you could not live alone, because the amount of food that you would be able to plant was not enough for yourself, or if you care for animals, or if you need some other individuals, because the day still had 24 hours and you could not do everything. But with technology, you can actually have machines doing some of the work for us, and we can do a lot more today as a single human being than we could do in the past. So progress, in a way, progress in some ways allows us, to isolate ourselves more and more. But it's an interesting conundrum because at the same time that progress allows us to isolate ourselves so much, it also makes us very dependent from one another. Because in those days, for instance, we all had a little patch of garden where we grew some vegetables or fruits, or we had animals. Nowadays, we don't. Most of us do not. So if we rely on someone to provide us with the basic necessities of life, like food, but we always forget about that. We don't remember those things when we do not remind ourselves of those things. So this independence that technological progress has given to us is actually a chimera. It's actually an illusion, and we need to move away from it. Use technological progress, of course, that's why it's there for us to use it, but not allow that technological progress to get in the way of our fraternity, of our solidarity, of our ideals of universal love, of understanding, not just tolerance, but understanding. So, back in essence to the divine word, to the divine examples of our Master Jesus Christ. Anyone has a question or comment?
Yeah, I was thinking while you were explaining. Let me make a simple question. So, what we are trying to get back to the simplicity of Jesus' teachings, right?
Say it again, please. I didn't hear. Sorry.
What we are trying to do with these lessons is to go back to the simplicity of Jesus' teachings, right?
Yes.
Okay. And because I always, of course we can understand Jesus, but I always get myself in thinking why he never let anything. No, he never wrote down anything. So everything that we know is the interpretation and from the people that the apostles that were around them, that we know as well they were not like they were like us. So the interpretation, understand that some religions say that they were inspired by God or whatever, and then we study also that whatever was they write was translated in different ways in different language. So we have all this diluted or changer or whatever it is that we got to a point that we have the teachings in our hands nowadays. So so my question would be, we keep on studying everything that Jesus left to us and trying to understand the different lessons and the different things that he left to us. But do you think, and I don't know if it's a question of Spirit's answer or maybe your personal opinion, that if we stick just with do to others what uh, would want to do to yourself, because I think this is the simplest way to sum everything that Jesus left to us, will be enough. You understand my point?
Um, I hope I do. Let's see. um, there is a saying that we can't chew and whistle at the same time. So it's either one or the other, but not both, not at the same time. If Christ had sat down and written all these things, he would not have been there preaching them, living them through examples of conduct. And he would have been just another scholar. And as a scholar, he would not have had as much influence, perhaps, because he would have probably been seen as a well-educated, isolated human being from the rest of the population. Quite the opposite. He was there among the simplest men and women. He spoke their language. He made his examples out of their lives, out of their lore, their um, customs. He did not introduce crazy, fantastic, philosophical principles. Everything was the simplest possible. Because that, like I said before, that allowed them not only to relate to it, but because the examples were simple enough, they could tell others about that. When we see the Gospels were not even written at the time of Christ or immediately after his death. It was some time. And we might say, oh, but if they been written basically at the time of Christ, they would not have been so conspurcated, so damaged, so changed. No, they would have. They would have, because there are two factors at play in the changes of the Gospels, or in the changes of what Christ left as an example of what happened and what we get today. One is ignorance. When you don't understand something, even if you have no malice, you are going to change the meaning of it when you relay that information, because you're going to relay that information with the vocabulary that you have and the understanding that you have. And you miss a lot of points that were perhaps very important, crucial even, but you just could not tell that they were crucial, essential, because you're just ignorant of them. No malice. And there's also the malice. Perhaps the malice is the worst part, because in the malice, you have a very crafty human being behind it, altering with a purpose. Because when you are just simple and ignorant, your alterations of the truth are random. And when you get the alteration from person A, B, C, D, E, F, eventually, if you're a historian, you can realize and you can go back and and recover the truth, because every person alters it a little bit, but very specifically according to his or her level of ignorance. But there's always something that remains intact, and you can actually realize that from all the people that you interview, or all the historical points that you research, which is what Kardec did exactly. Kardec did not know what the truth was, and he did not have, it wasn't like Emmanuel saying to him, do this, do that, or this. No, he actually looked at it from a dispassionate point of view and saw that the same question given to different locations had a kernel of truth in all of them, and he compiled that. So variations from one sense to another. We're not going to call them spiritist centers in those days. From one sense to another, from one mediumistic meeting to another, because of the members of that mediumistic meeting, but all members with the good intention in their hearts, that their personal variations in the end did not conspurcate the truth, because Kardec was able to see the kernel, the essence, the core, by pulling together information from different sources. So it is when we talk about those who change a little bit the ideas or the examples that Christ left was through ignorance. But when someone is malicious, oh, that is a different story. Because in malice, the person knows exactly where someone cleverer than they are might realize the truth is, and reverse the process to go back to that truth. So what they do is that they hide that truth. They hide their tracks. That's a lot harder for us to look. It's very hard, much harder for us to analyze. So the dust of centuries or 2 millennia is not so important as as malice has been. And malice would have happened whether Christ had written everything at his time or himself or not, because malice is malice. When someone is intent on destroying something, is their free will, is that individual's free will, and he or she will be able to carry it out. And this again is why we are always asked to think, to be rational, to evaluate, to analyze, to judge in the sense of evaluation, analysis, everything that we hear. Because just by saying, oh, it's a spiritist lesson, who said that? Even if it was dictated, let's say it was a communication dictated by a spirit, how do we know that that spirit is a spirit of it's an echelon, from a high echelon, or if that a spirit is actually not a spirit whose intention is to mock or even move us away from the righteous path. So when and how is not important. Is what we do with the information that we have today. And we do have the golden rule to do unto others what we would expect or would like others to do unto us. We have that. From that, at our level, that alone at our level should be enough for us to judge everything that happens to us, everything that we do, say, and think, and guide, correct our path towards perfection. It is not the only thing, but our level right now, it is what we can master. It's what is available to us at our level of moral and intellectual development. When we move away from this planet, or this planet changes and becomes something much more than today, perhaps we'll learn other truths or other layers of truth towards the absolute truth that right now we cannot even conceive, much less follow. But what we have right now is the golden rule, and the golden rule is enough. The truth is, it really does not matter if Jesus was under a sycamore tree, or if it was an elm tree, or was an oak tree. In the end, those details that we sometimes change when we speak, when we tell the story from one person to another, and we forget and we add, it's much less relevant than this type of detail is much less relevant than the kernel, the core of the lesson, which is always fraternity, solidarity, understanding, and universal love.
Thanks, Julia.
Okay, we continue, Julia, right?
Yes, please, sir.
Okay. The twilight of a civilization. A cloud of smoke has been forming for a long time on the horizons of an earth that is filled with industries of death and destruction. Each and every country has been called upon to check the state of humankind's spiritual maturation, which has been taking place over the past 2,000 years. The scientific progress of cultures and their noblest and most generous victories are contradicted by the feast of bloodshed and ambition. And while the politics of the world are fettered by the dolorous events of the century, new activities are taking place in the spirit world, for the guidance of the earth is in the merciful and august hands of the Lamb.
Thank you. So we're talking about close to 2,000 years, about 1900 years or 19 centuries between Christ and the time this book was written. And we see the exact same picture when we look at humanity as a whole. At the time of Christ, during the emperor, the Roman, the period of the Roman Empire, we have Tiberius as their emperor, and this was actually after Tiberius was actually the second Roman emperor. This is already after two triumvirates. When we watched, if we could go back in time with a time machine, we would be watching the fall of the great Roman Republic. This is just before the birth of Christ. So this is what we still call the before the Common Era, or before Christ in the old days. And we see not only corruption, assassinations, briberies, a vile political agendas, but we also see the Roman Empire, the Roman Republic, expanding to a point that it got so big that it needed more and more raw materials to satiate its hunger for everything that was luxurious. And we see at the very end of the Republic, a civilization, the Romans, right? Becoming more and more, well, lazier and lazier, more and more indolent, and expecting more and more individuals around the world, around their in their properties, in their empire, in the areas dominated by the Republic, to serve them. And this is when the Republic begins to fall apart. And you have two periods where you have three governors. That's why it's called triumvirate. And they do not succeed. And then we start the Roman Empire. So we see what? We see the Roman Republic coming out of the Carthaginian Wars, the Punic Wars, at this time, only for what? Domination of the mercantile areas in the Mediterranean. And what we see when this book was written in the eve of the Second World War is exactly the same thing. Powers at be fighting for the world's precious raw materials and areas and control of those areas. We had moved away from a situation of slavery throughout the world. Most of the colonies had become independent in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. But they were still providing, particularly Europe, with all the luxuries. And where does it happen? Well, the war happens exactly there, for control of everything in the economic world. So we don't see much of a difference between the time of Christ or previous, just immediately before the time of Christ, and the time this book was written. We see a very similar pattern. The only difference is that at the time of Christ, we have only one power, the Roman Empire, sucking the very blood and life and essence of everything everywhere by the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire. By the time Rome becomes an empire, it is the beginning of the end. It still took 453 years after Christ for the Roman Empire to succumb, at least the one on the west, and then another 1,000 years in 1453 for the Roman Empire of the East to succumb. But they each went, and they each went in the same way, by the generation of the political principles, of the ideals of citizenry, not necessarily citizenship, because that concept is much, much later. Citizenship comes with the, with the French Revolution, but citizenry, the idea of belonging to a community, not necessarily a country. And what we see in 1939 is exactly this. Here, just 2,000 years later, or almost 2,000 years later, we see the same fight for precious natural resources, raw materials, and we have not learned that much from 1939 to today, unfortunately. It's almost a century, close to a century, and we cannot say that we have learned that much more. So we have to be very careful because we are repeating patterns just with different players, and perhaps the play itself is told in a different way, but the concept behind the play is still the same. And the twilight of a civilization, we speak of this, is for us, in order for us to be able to move towards a true civilization on earth, is for us to go, tying together with the previous one, the divine word, is for us to go back to the simplicity of Christ's teachings. Simplicity of Christ's teachings is not that we're going to be wearing sandals and commune with nature and not live in houses or apartments. It's not that. A lot of people get it wrong. Very, very way off, actually, way off. It's the simplicity of feelings, solidarity, fraternity, universal love. Once again, I repeat. In the next chapter, we are going to talk about Emmanuel is going to talk about the Roman Empire and the fall of the Roman civilization. This, I think, will help us quite a lot. We are going to see when Emmanuel discusses about the Roman Empire, how many things we are still mirroring today in our behavior. Not constructive things, unfortunately.
It goes back to us having the intellectual progress moving faster than the moral progress, which is always the issue, right?
Yes.
And it reaches a point that the intellectual progress has to wait for the evolution of the moral progress in a sense, right? It's not really, because intellectual progress keeps evolving, but it cannot go only by itself, because at some point it catches up. We need to evolve morally to create better life conditions for all of us, right? And you see a lot of what happened in the Roman Empire. There was a lot of intellectual progress, but not much of a moral progress. And 2,000 years later, we have a lot more intellectual progress and some moral progress. Of course, we don't behave in the same way that we behaved at the time of the Roman Empire. Sorry about that.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah. Sorry, interrupted by the dog, by the phone, everything. Go ahead, Julia.
Yeah, I was just going to say one interesting thing when we have a bird's eye view of human history is that as we look from, the further away we go from today, so if we go backwards in time, right? The further away we go, we see how the empires lasted a lot longer in those days than they do today. Today we see civilizations or countries or empires or principates or whatever it is, republics, becoming very prominent, and very quickly they move away from that position of prominence. Not necessarily that they are ruined completely, but that's another difference. So what we see is the closer we get to our modern times, the shorter is the span of any country, empire, any particular form of government that stays in power or that stays in a position of privilege for that long. And the other thing, the other difference is that in those days, when a civilization, an empire, a principate, whatever, they would move away from a position of privilege, of being the first power, they were normally annihilated, sorry, or they would be just, they would just go uh, to a situation of not just being second, but being poor, or simply that disappear. And today what we see is not exactly that. So it's not so much all or none anymore, but at the same time, they don't remain in power for much longer, which tells us that things move at a much faster pace today, and you cannot be at the top for a long time. So it's another suggestion for humility, because our minute in the sun, before it used to be an hour or a day, then it's an hour. Now it's basically a minute, perhaps going to be a second very soon, right? As we move towards, and the reason for this is because then we are becoming more and more equitable. We are dividing we are being capable, if we look at the whole process of human civilization and history, we are becoming more and more capable of dividing our resources, even though we're still fighting for them. But they don't stay in the hands of one empire or one power, let's say, for as long as they used to. The Roman Empire had over 2,000 years. If you count the western and the eastern part of the Roman civilization, it had almost 2,000 years of of uh, rain, and today you don't see anything like that.
The Egyptians were even more, right? Or like
And
3,000.
the Egyptians were even more, yes. So to think about, so the Egyptians even further behind, right? But by the time you see the Egyptians, you move to the Persians, you meet the Babylonians, the Persians. By the time you get to the Roman Empire, then you start having smaller and smaller periods, all right? And we see that there is a trend that the length of these empires, of these civilizations, or these powers, they are decreasing. And the other point that we want to convey is that, like I said, when they step up, so they step down from the position of being the first ones, unlike in the past when they would be annihilated or destroyed, or they would be in a very bad situation that would be conquered and be enslaved. Nowadays we don't see these things, but they just step down from the position of being the first, but they still keep some level of advancement, some level of good quality of life, which is good. It tells us that something at least has been moving in the right direction towards progress. But we're still fighting for natural resources. We're still fighting for raw materials, and we're still fighting for control, power. There we have learned very little, unfortunately. We have just changed the way we go about it.
Hey, Julio. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. So, so this is a plan of trial and expiation. We are moving to regeneration, but we still trials and expiations. So, and I understand that's one thing that Elmo always say. There's always a possibility. There's always a change to improve and do better. But you just said that we are repeating history and we're still doing the same crazy thing that we do in the past, evolving just a little bit. So since we are expecting governors and countries and even within our family to get along and and do the right thing. But again, this is a planet of trials and expiations. So if this was a happy planet or some kind of different planet with different level of vibration and spirits, we could have, expected something like this happen. So my question is to see that everything that's happening and not be surprised, understanding that this is the level that we are. We can hope for the best, but it's rarely happen. Is this a pessimist view or would be a realistic view considering the level that we are right now?
So I'm going to ask everyone's forgiveness, but I'm going to take the liberty to be Ebenezer Scrooge and say humbug. We are not moving towards a planet of regeneration. It's a myth, and a very bad one. Now that I have shocked everyone, let me explain what I mean by that. The planet will not move, will not become one of regeneration if we do not change. We are the ones who must change for the planet to be perceived as a planet of regeneration. The planet is physical. Of course, we can embellish the physical planet as well when we change ourselves and we begin to be more, to exercise more solidarity, more fraternity among ourselves. But it's very important that we all understand that the planet itself is not changing. It's not that the planet will change and then we will get a planet that is of regeneration. That is a myth. That is the same thing as believing in unicorns or believing that someone can say to us, oh, bling, today you're good people. You're perfect people. And I'm not saying this because Renato is to Renato, okay? I'm using his question to address everyone. Never forget this. Or every time I answer it in general terms for all of us. I'm just using Renato's words and question to bring a very important point for all of us spiritists. We must understand that there is not such a thing as the planet becoming a planet of regeneration. We have to change. If we change, our planet will be seen, perceived as one of regeneration, not the other way around. The planet will not start the process. We will. And in doing so, we have to move away from pessimism. We have to move away from the idea that, oh, that's reality. I can't do much about it. No, we can. Each and every one of us can. We can by being a nicer neighbor, a nicer husband or wife, or father, or mother, or uncle, or aunt, whatever. A better person at work, a better person in the community, the immediate community, whether it's a neighbor, right with the neighbor, or the whole building, or the block. These are the things we can do. Because good behavior is contagious. Good behavior is contagious. Once we start, others start as well, like a domino effect. There will always be a sourpuss. There will always be an Ebenezer Scrooge among us, someone who will not change at all, that will make everyone's life miserable, but that individual will become more and more isolated, not because we are going to be retaliating and icing that person, but that because that person will not find in us a mirror to his or her thoughts or actions. That individual will not be able to find in us someone who agrees with them, agrees with their negativity, or with their rambunctiousness, or with their disregard for others or the environment or the community. and they'll become more and more isolated to a point where they will not be they will not feel welcome among us. And we will have changed the community for the better. So we have to roll up our sleeves and do our part. Who cares if there's a war on the other side of the globe? As long as we have not started it, and as long as we're not indirectly profiting by it, we have to pray for that, but we have to do our best locally. Like I said, we start locally in small things, what we can afford to do, not financially, but what we can do based on our limitations. We'll be making this a better environment. And one day, when the majority of us will have inclinations towards the good rather than towards evil, the planet will be perceived, seen as one of regeneration. We can speed it up or delay. It's all on us. It depends on when we start doing our part. I think it's a very good question because we address this issue of that nothing is going to come down from the heavens to us. It's not going to be a gift. We are going to make it into a better planet. We're going to make it into a better world, but only if we start with ourselves.
Thank you, Julio.
Okay. John, can we finish? There's only one item.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Crisis example. Without referring to the transitory political problems of the world, however, let us remember that crisis lessons have forever taken hold on the earth as a treasure for all the unfortunate and forsaken. His word has built up faith in human souls, enabling them to catch a glimpse of their glorious destiny. Should the need arise, we should once more see faith and hope being reunited in new Roman catacombs to resurrect the Christian meaning of humankind's civilization. Many times it is in humble and afflicted hearts that we find the divine word singing the wonderful hymn of the blessed. To close this chapter, recalling the divine master's influence on all earth's suffering hearts, let us remember the story of the monk of Malian, who, accused of plotting the freedom of his homeland from the yoke of the Spanish, was sentenced to death and led to the scaffold. At the moment of his death, the poor monk sobbed in desperation. Why must I die innocent? Where is justice? What have I done to deserve such a dreadful death? But one of his companions ran up to him and whispered to him, Jesus too was innocent. Then the victim saw a light of mysterious beauty. He wiped his tears, serenity returned to his haggard face, and when the executor asked for his forgiveness before pulling the sinister handle, the resigned monk answered, my son, not only do I forgive you, but I ask you to please fulfill your duty as well.
Thank you. Okay. So here, what we see is, remember, we were just talking about 1939, just before the Second World War. And this is why it says here, transitory political problems. And we see that today. There's always going to be a transitory political problem because greed and unbridled ambition will be among us for a long time still. So there'll always be someone trying to seize power, someone trying to have even more power. There will always be that individual. But the idea here is of the simplicity of the teachings. The idea of the Roman catacombs, where in the most insalubrious of environments, the most horrifying of the environments, The Christians were congregating to express their genuine faith. So it didn't matter the stench. It didn't matter that they were knee deep in sewage. It did not matter that they were in such an insalubrious, unhealthy environment. Their faith was above all of that. Today, perhaps we don't find ourselves in a situation so dire as that one, but we have certain things, certain situations around the world that can mimic or can be the modern equivalent of those days. And we are going to find in these individuals the true faith, the simple, genuine faith that Christ wanted all of us to have. When it says here that it's in the humble and afflicted hearts that we find the divine word more often, it's usually because they are the ones less concerned with the material things. And by material things here, I don't mean necessarily possessions, just necessarily things of the material world, of the physical world, attachment. Whenever we say material things, we immediately think of attachment to riches. It's not that. It can be attachment to a tree of the physical world and make it so important that we will actually steamroll over everyone and everything because of that tree. And you might say, "Oh, that's strange." Well, it's not, because the idea is the attachment to something that is physical. We never said it had to be to gold in particular, to coin, to assets. Of course, that's the easiest one to be attached to, because having assets, financial assets, having wealth, having fortune also will bring to us power, prestige, and a lot of other things. But it's not necessarily that. We can actually live a very simple life, financially speaking, in this world, and still go back to the spiritual realm completely attached to material things. Oh, it was the pen that someone gave me when I was, I don't know, 16 years old, and it was this and that. Or it can be even, like I said, to a tree or to a garden, to a house, and things like that. The whole idea is the simplicity of the heart. It's a life that places human beings and life itself ahead of everything else. And if we truly believe in the Christian doctrine, in the Christian ideals, we will do this. We will begin looking at humankind, at humanity in that sense, and not just as another person next to us, whether it's brother, sister, or old or young or this or that. What we'll see is another human being, another one like us who deserve the same thing we would like for ourselves. When we begin our journey towards this humble behavior, we don't have to be afflicted to learn the lessons of the Master. Actually, it's best when we practice the lessons of the Master when we are not afflicted, because then we are truly in control of our actions, of our thoughts. We are not being driven by the vicissitude or the difficulty itself. We are being driven by a genuine awareness of the need of others. And there is nothing more beautiful than that. That is a true charity, when the need of another becomes our own need, and we act in a way that is very natural, because we are acting as if we are acting on our behalf for ourselves. But as a matter of fact, we are acting towards another. And this is the lesson of the monk of Manila during one of the Americans' insurgencies against the Spanish conquistadors or governors at the time. When brought to that point, there was a moment of desperation. Of course, we are all human beings, we're all spirits progressing. So if you see yourself being burned at the point of being burned alive, of course you're going to to be in desperation. But then, When someone just whispered to him that Jesus had to go through that and he had nothing to expiate, the person immediately recomposed himself, the monk recomposed himself, realized that that moment of torment, of torture that was imminent would be just a very fleeting second against eternity. And he recomposed himself, pardoned his executioner because it's not the executioner's fault. He's not being judged by the executioner. It moved on to the other life, to the real life, with peace in his mind. But you notice that he had to move away from the moment of desperation. If he had done all this of the forgiveness and everything just because of the trauma of the imminent moment, it would not have carried as much weight. It would still have been positive, of course, but would not have carried as much weight as when he recomposed himself, analyzed his situation in comparison to our master, and realized, okay, this is nothing. And he probably thought, he probably thought to himself, I do have a few things to expiate. I'm not as perfect as the master was or is. And this is what brought him a genuine feeling of serenity that came from within him to outside, to the outside. It is the simplicity of thoughts that allows us the simplicity of actions, speech, okay, to be carried out and to have in ourselves the implementation of all the goodness that our master left to us in his teachings and in his examples of behavior.
Okay, thanks, Julio. We started late due to technical problems. We're going to finish a little bit later also, but still, we did a good time. So the announcements for today, we're doing this GoFundMe, trying to raise money to help us with the expenses of SGNY. Most of you that are here already contributed, and we appreciate the help and assistance. Anyway, I put the link there on the chat if anyone wants to help us. We will continue, and we appreciate all those that can help. We understand all those that cannot help because we are all going through difficult situations here. Next Sunday, which is the fourth Sunday of the month, normally we do special lectures, and we are going to continue our fundamentals of mediumship, a series of lectures. I'll be presenting, I believe it's chapter 6. It's lesson 6. I'll check with Julio and Elmo, but if I remember correctly, but I'll be presenting that. In 3 weeks' time, we have our symposium that is going to be over 2 days on the weekend, Saturday from 4 to 7 p.m. our time, Sunday from noon to 3 p.m. our time. We invite you all to join, to be part of it. It's an important annual event for Spiritism in the US, especially for Spiritism in English in the US. And this is the first year that we are doing it virtual, of course, with all this that's going on. And we invite you all to join us and to be part of it. Okay, more information. It's going every 3 times a week on our email that you get from Thais. And what else do we have? I think that's all right. I think that's all. So we'll ask Carol to do our final prayer for us.
Sure. Infinite Creator, all goodness and grace, we are grateful today for the opportunity to be together, for fraternity, to receive the understanding, the teachings, the love, the light, and the healings. We are ever so grateful to our spiritual benefactors, the mentors, the good spirits, those who are assisting us to progress. We are grateful for their help, encouraging us to have courage, to be mindful, to do the right thing each day, to have heart, and to create a vibration that is stronger each day. For this, we are grateful. As we continue throughout the week, may we continue with our prayers, with our studies, with our mindfulness and contemplations, not to lose